I'd like to welcome you to this afternoon's session, and the theme is New Trends in Marriage and Family Therapy. Our first speaker is Dr. Michael Bruwer, and you did hear him last night. Those of you who are here would have heard him on the panel last night, but I'm going to tell you just a little bit about him. He comes originally from South Africa, but he is now a citizen of the United States, and he studied his medicine in the United States, and he has also taken his residency in general psychiatry, and this he took at the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota. His real field and his real interest, he says, is family therapy, and he has his fellowship in family therapy and child psychology. He has, besides family therapy as an interest, he has many other interests, and I'll just mention a few. The influence of personal world views on individual mental health. The influence of language on health. Religion and psychiatry. Wholeness and wellness. It's also interesting, I think, to hear that he is just about to publish a book of poetry. And I find that the doctors I come in contact have many interests outside in music or art, and I'm interested now to meet someone who is just going to publish a book on poetry. I was told that he was very influenced by the writing of K. Buckminster Fuller. Now, some of you may know that author, and a lot of his writing was on synergetics, and I think that perhaps we'll hear more of that during this session. And Dr. Bruwer tells me he is influenced by three families: the family he has created, and with his wife, they have one child, the family he comes from, and the family he married into. So with a man who feels, looks at life this way, with connection with three families, a person who has written poetry, and with his medical and his background in psychotherapy, I think we have a very well-qualified person to talk about the poetry of loving, family therapy, and the Baha'i faith. So, Dr. Bruwer. I'm just going to say that we're sorry we're starting a little late. We hope that the speakers will keep to their 3/4 of an hour and 15 minutes for questions so that we won't be too late when we finish. And I'll just leave it to you now, Dr.
Thank you. I have written my talk out, and because it came spontaneously in bits and pieces, which I later synthesized, and they would come at 4 o'clock in the morning and from dreams, and when I was feeling very strongly, I want to read it. I realize that puts a little distance between us, but I'm willing to live with it. And I apologize to the translators for not having had a copy ready for them. I didn't know I was supposed to. I think the reason that Dr. Dinesh asked me to give this talk was that he realized that I was more pregnant than I thought I was, and recognized the need for an early and easy delivery. These ideas began to pour out in the short time that followed. Where I don't connect them clearly together, I know that your own associational brain cortex will do the job. And if any of it's hard to follow, it may be because I was born upside down in the southern hemisphere, left-handed and cross-eyed, with nose that runs and feet that smell. When I look in a mirror, I think that's what I look like. I don't realize that right and left are reversed. And then when I realize that, then I wonder why aren't top and bottom reversed? And I find it a very confusing world. I was going to say thank you to the people who helped me along this path, but I know I don't have enough time to say everything I want to say. It's my belief that we're all the walking wounded, no matter how exalted our families of origin may be, because we are the generation of the half-light, and we are the heirs of the accumulated horrors of many, many years. And just talking to Rihia Khanum, she says that in the Western world we are living in a human sewer, and if we were to hear of an epidemic coming, we would be prepared for it. We'd try to do something about it. We'd know what kind of contagions we could catch. But because it's a moral and emotional and psychological sewer, we have a much harder time dealing with it. And my question is, how can we, the walking wounded, how can we raise a more whole and healthy generation? How can two walking woundeds add up to one not wounded? We have to intervene to break a vicious cycle. Talking about the unification of mankind, Shoghi Effendi says, this will indeed be the fitting climax of that process of integration which, starting with the family, the smallest unit in the scale of human organization, must, after having called successively into being the tribe, the city-state, and the nation, continue to operate until it culminates in the unification of the whole world, the final object and crowning glory of human evolution on this planet. I surmise that in the Baha'i faith, the regeneration of the world will come about in the same sequence. Individual, family, tribe, or extended family, community, nation, and world. Witness how in the early annals of the faith that what stands out are the heroes, individuals. Many of the great teachers were single or unmarried most of their lives. Now in our communications and in the plans, we have much more of an emphasis on the family. I hope to introduce family therapy to those not familiar with it, to exchange some ideas with those who are, and to try and relate some of the major concepts in family therapy to the Baha'i teachings. And there are a number of key ideas that I'm going to try to address. They are family, wholeness, poetry, individuation, growth, models of reality, relationship, the invisible, triangulation, paradox, therapy, existential experience, symbolic experience, and family therapy as metaphor. I know it's awfully hard to take notes when I talk this fast, but I think you can process it if you hear it. You may not be able to write it all down. I will focus on why I think family and family therapy are important. Some of the reasons follow. Your family is your archetypal pattern of human relationships. Your family is deeply imprinted in you via all sensory modalities. It is the most basic biopsychosocial tarot deck of our lives. It is nucleus and pattern. Family is the valve through which the generations of humanity flow. Family is a metaphor for the whole human race and for the family of nations. Family therapy is international in scope, with a strong bond that cuts across professions and guilds. Family is context, and behavior out of context is ambiguous. And terms from family are our ultimate metaphors for other relationships. The brotherhood of mankind, the everlasting Father, Mother Earth. The idea of therapy indicates the need for help from outside. You probably can't be your own therapist any more than you can tickle yourself. I doubt that you could construct a machine with which to tickle yourself. Therapy, like tickling, is at least a two-person event. The emphasis in the faith on consultation about all matters great and small is related to this. Because of our inner powers, as enumerated by Abdul Baha in Some Answered Questions, of imagination or image forming and memory, we function symbolically in terms of images and their associations. Often the problem in the family is not where it appears to be, but is symbolic of something else taking place in the family. The emphasis in family therapy on seeing, quote, the problem as a symptom of pain in the family and not as an isolated disease in one person helps us to appreciate the phenomenon of unity and of our own responsibility to deal with our own lives, and to see that the personal spiritual battles we don't deal with can become problems for our neighbors in the next generation. This emphasis on personal maturation means that the therapist often helps by not helping, by not intruding, by not succumbing to the insistent urge to help, which is so often a form of interference to help relieve the anxiety of the therapist. The therapist may do many things to facilitate positive change in the family, but he should not try to help in the sense of stealing the other person's anxiety, which is his motor or motivation or initiative for change. Family therapy highlights the insidious and destructive results of triangulation, whose subset phenomena, gossip and backbiting, are severely proscribed in the writings. The institutions of the faith supply the major safe outlet for triangulation, but may themselves be subject to it. I'm going to explain what triangulation is later. Detriangulation ultimately rests on the maturation of the individual. Triangulation, symbolic experience, and relationship all highlight the importance of appreciating that which we can't see, the invisible, unity, betweenness, the unconscious. The importance in family therapy on the continuing growth of the therapist versus reliance on techniques challenges the widely touted dictum of be consistent with the more realistic phenomenon of the unpredictability of higher orders of wholeness. It is easier to know what a hydrogen atom is going to do next than it was to know what Abdu'l-Baha was going to do next. Family therapy is in harmony with the teaching of the faith that evil does not exist. In family therapy, negative behaviors are often interpreted positively. They are often seen as acts of self-sacrifice to draw attention away from more painful issues in the family and are thereby protective measures. The assumption is that the family is at root healthy and its behaviors are positively motivated. It's a positive approach. One reaches the point where the rationale for family therapy seems obvious and vital. There are some things about family therapy that are not so obvious. One is that the number of relationships between individuals, when you have 4 or more people, and in most families when you have in-laws you have that, is much greater than the number of individuals. And the other is that if you draw a picture of these relationships, the picture doesn't show you which relationship is most important. The most important relationship is the husband-wife relationship, the mother-father relationship, the marriage. This is an axis around which the other relationships revolve. I just have a few slides to highlight this. Here I've drawn 5 circles or 5 shapes to represent the people in the family. And then, which is forward here, in the next slide I've drawn in all the connections between them. And I've included connections descending from that top relationship because I'm considering those two the parents. And in many senses, like to think of the children as being descended from the relationship between the parents and not just from the parents individually. So you can see we start off with 5 people. We've already got, I think, 13 relationships there. So the relationships, the invisible, add a degree of complexity that we don't intuit. You don't see it. The number of relationships between people in this room must just be extraordinary. And then every member of the family in his own head, in his own memory and imagination, has an image of all these other people and some idea of what all those relationships are in the family. And you can see how that generates an even more complex picture. And then you have ideas. In my mind, I have an idea about what your ideas are about what the relationships are. And so it's a very complex network of relationships. And elsewhere I'll mention how Abdul-Baha talks about nature in terms of relationships. See, that's all for... This has all been by way of introduction. Now I'll talk in more depth about some of these things. Because I have stressed how important the appreciation of that which we can't see is, I would like to tell two stories. I may just shorten it to one. The first is from a lecture by the author Lawrence van der Post, a South African author who's written extensively about the Bushmen. And he's telling a story that his nurse told him, and she was half Bushman, half Hottentot. He has incredible respect for the mental capacity and the knowledge of these people. And the story goes like this. Once in the days of the early race, there was a man who captured a superb head of cattle. Each morning, he found that they had already been milked. He sat up to watch, and he noticed that night that a cord descended from the stars, and down it came some young women of the people of the stars. He ran for them, and they ran away as fast as they could. And just as they were going up the rope, he managed to catch one by a leg, and he pulled her back and married her. Their life would have been happy but for one thing. She had with her, when he caught her, a tightly woven basket with a lid fitted tightly into its neck. She said to him, "There is only one thing that I ask of you, and that is that you will never look into this basket without my permission." He promised. He couldn't stand it. One day when she was away, he had to open the basket, and he looked in the basket, and he laughed. In the evening, his wife came home, and after one look at him, she knew what had happened. She said, "You've looked in the basket." He said, "Yes, I have." And then he added, "You silly, silly woman, the basket is empty." And she said, "You saw nothing in the basket?" "No, nothing." Thereupon, looking very sad, she turned her back on him and vanished into the sunset. You know, it didn't matter so much his breaking his promise not to look into the basket. What was so awful was that looking in the basket, he saw nothing in it. That he couldn't see all the wonderful things that she had brought from the stars for them both. This, in a sense, is our situation. The primitive, the first things of life, stand in rags and tatters, and every day we lift the lid of our own particular basket and look inside and see nothing in it. I'm going to skip the second story, which is something from me in medical school, and how lack of appreciation of this invisibleness was a disaster for me. Now, to give a little more idea of how the word family is used in the writings, I'm just going to read a few passages from the writings where the word family is used, just to give us a sense of it. From Abdul-Baha. Compare the nations of the world to the members of a family. A family is a nation in miniature. Simply enlarge the circle of the household, and you have the nation. Enlarge the circle of nations, and you have all humanity. Man cannot live singly and alone. He is in need of continuous cooperation and mutual help. For example, a man living alone in the wilderness will eventually starve. He can never, singly and alone, provide himself with all the necessities of existence. Therefore, he is in need of cooperation and reciprocity. The mystery of this phenomenon, the cause thereof is this, that mankind hath been created from one single origin, has branched off from one family. Thus, in reality, all mankind represents one family. Although the body politic is one family, yet because of lack of harmonious relations, some members are comfortable and some in direst misery. Why? Because this family lacks necessary reciprocity and symmetry. For each of the creatures is a sign of God, and it was by the grace of God and of the Lord and His power that each did step into the world. Therefore they are not strangers, but in the family. And then there's a beautiful passage from the Baha'i Education compilation on how everybody, the family bond must be respected, and everybody, all the members must be educated in its sanctity, and that everybody has, all these relationships have responsibilities to each other, the people at each end of them. And in the book by Baha'i Nakjavani called When We Grow Up, she goes into what some of these relationships are, including the role of the father and the role of the mother. Some things that I hadn't seen before, and I recommend it to you to read. And then from the House of Justice, Baha'u'llah came to bring unity to the world, and the fundamental unity is that of the family. Now I'd like to explain my title, The Poetry of Loving. Dr. Carl Whitaker, one of my teachers, was once asked by one of the editors of one of the marriage and family journals, family therapy journals, in which direction family therapy should be looking to the future as to what to concern itself with. And he said this. He said, "Can we get away from all this talk about techniques and instead get to the poetry of loving?" He didn't elaborate on that, but it just struck a chord with me, and I liked it, and I've been attached to that phrase ever since. In one of his books, C.S. Lewis, the Christian author, says that the best definition of poetry that he had heard of was that poetry is the same in the other. Poetry is the same in the other. At the very simplest level, that's what a rhyme is. It's the same sound in another word. And poetry is a whole way of expressing things in a metaphorical way, of creating feelings within one that resonate with the feelings of the poet. This reflective faculty of seeing the same in the other is responsible for so much of what goes on with people. In the negative sense, it is known as projection, attributing to others aspects of ourselves that we can't accept. Positively, we are told that in the writings that what we ultimately must reflect is the love of God. This whole concept of reflection, of poetry, of the same in the other, occurs in much of the talk about systems and cybernetics, and the family is often looked at as a system of organization. Other similar terms that will be recognized by some of you are reflection, reflexive, recursive, and self-referential. In fact, we are told that the human spirit, the reality of man, is his thought, or his reflective faculty. There is only one source of light. All the rest is reflection. There are many different kinds of mirroring going on in the family. He looks just like you, John. Mary, she looks like your mother. You go first this time. I went first last time. Reflection such as this makes one think of reciprocity and symmetry, those things that Abdu'l-Baha says are so lacking in the family of man. Let your hearts be like two pure mirrors reflecting the stars of the heaven of love and beauty. In family therapy, hopefully the therapist can model some of the qualities of mature individuation, the ability to join and the ability to separate. His ability to see the people as whole people and not as problems. To see the people as beings and not as their behaviors. To see the people as beings and not as their diagnoses. And that he can mirror this mature way of relating. Now I would like to talk some more about the concept of family. This is not from the writings. This is just some phenomenological facts about families. Individuals are individuals. At a simplistic level, it is almost possible to draw a circle around them. But families are partially overlapping and require more appreciation of ambiguousness or indeterminacy. As a married man and father, I am a member of 3 families, as was said before. The one I come from, the one I married into, and the one I've helped create. The family is a collective center. Family is an internalized set of relationships. The family is more than just the bodies that make it up, just as the person is more than his body. The family is like a hologram. In the memory and experience of each member is represented the whole rest of the family and the ghosts of the previous generations. The family is a complex of always and only coexisting entities. The existence of one generates the other. You don't have a husband without a wife, a son without a father. I suspect the greatest power in the world is in the bonds of the nuclear family and the feelings generated there. Anybody who's ever done group therapy knows the feelings can get very strong in the room. But get in there with a family in that room, and the feelings are of a whole different order of intensity, much stronger. Family is a bio-psychosocial spiritual unit. This makes family relationships much stronger and more loaded than relationships in other groups, even though in reality other groups are part of the extended cousinhood of mankind. But the immediate biological family, the relationships are very strong. How are we doing? Oh. Experientially, the strongest feelings are generated in the nuclear family. The family is an organism. In the brain, there is no one control center. The brain is many, many different centers, each influencing all the rest. Of course, we know the control is the all-unifying agency, the soul. I think the family functions in much the same way as the brain. Overtly, father may seem to be in control. Covertly, mother may be in control. But then the control exerted by the helplessness of the infant is very strong. Therefore, I think of the family as being, or as problems being the offspring of the family and not the possession of any one member. The family is a whole. Wholes have a quality of being self-correcting, especially higher-order wholes. A major purpose of the health of the family and the health of the community and of the world is so that we as individuals may perceive wholeness out there, health out there, and thereby have wholeness in here in our perception of what goes on out there. This perceiving of wholeness out there is self-correcting for the wholeness in there. It's something we can compare with and match with. This is what the lesson of unity first means to me. In the Tablet of the Hague, Abdu'l-Baha says that peace is wonderful, but first it's necessary to have unity of conscience. We are enjoined to be obedient to our assemblies, even when they are wrong, because that obedience is unific, and from it will flow the correction of the wrong. Because we function symbolically and linguistically, we have models of the world as represented in our symbols and words. Health is model building, among other things. I used to try to have on the walls where I did my training pictures, words and diagrams that would remind me of the complexities of the psychodynamics of human beings. I think it's very important for people to do this kind of thing and for people to construct their own models, not to use mine or somebody else's, but to construct your own models of reality, so that you can play with them, discover their limitations, and compare them with other models and with your own experience, so that you can get a palpable way of experiencing the invisible, get a sense of these relationships, for instance. I'm afraid that the atmosphere of too many mental institutions conveys a very sterile, flat earth, cubistic model of the world. I also think it's important to have more than one kind of model, so that you don't get stuck in one model and mistake it for reality. So you don't get stuck in the picture. I think the medical model is a very poor model of persons. It is like talking about the outside model of the inside, or the plant model of the animal. Perhaps the same is true of the person model of families. The family is more than just the persons. Much of therapy deals with trying to correct people's models as reflected in their language and behavior. Language is a great servant and a poor master. The sun doesn't rise and set. The earth turns. The sun isn't doing the moving. Nabil's narrative isn't called the sunrisers. It's called the dawnbreakers. You don't go out of your mind or off the deep end or round the bend. Usually your nerves don't break down. You don't have nervous breakdowns. It's amazing how powerful these ways of talking, these kind of phrases that we never even think about, it's amazing the amount of influence they have on the way we see the world. We need to think both abstractly and concretely at the same time. I'm struck over and over again by the way Baha'u'llah mixes the two together. The concrete metaphor and abstraction in the same phrase as when he talks about the wine of certitude or the breezes of the all-glorious or the rose gardens of immortality. Over and over again. I don't think you can find a page in Baha'u'llah's writings where he isn't doing this. He's mixing the concrete with the abstract. He is tying together those so-called two halves of our brain, which is so popular to talk about these days, and I think valuable. It is important for a therapist to be able to read both halves simultaneously, to consciously straddle his corpus callosum, the connecting substance, to be literal and abstract at the same time. Some of the characteristics that Whitaker has proposed of the normal family are that it is healthy, growthful, syntropic, has a sense of esteem, is openly coordinated with its subgroups, is focused on its being in time present, it's alive, has an atmosphere of play, has a freedom for reasonable aggression, has flexible rules which include secrecy rights, is comfortable with an irrational component, has a freedom to admit non-members, has a strong sense of community, allows role changes. Children may play at being parents. Parents may act like children, but they don't get stuck. They don't get stuck in those roles. The family has a sense of itself as a whole. There is a separation of the generations. The children know they are children. The parents know they are parents. There's a 3 or 4 generation intrapsychic, in-memory family. Mom and dad talk about the old days. The children talk about the future, their future families. Father is supportively, excitedly involved with mother throughout her pregnancy and post-delivery and with early rearing of the child. Consequently, mother does not resent father, and this resentment is not then passed on to male offspring, and a unity of love is ensured to continuing generations of families. That's a very strong point. I'd like to go into it more later. The family has a life cycle. This is very important. As described by Dr. Milton Erickson, the family life cycle begins with courtship, goes on to marriage, childbirth and child rearing, growth of children, and the aging of parents. The weaning of parents from their children and children from their parents, and finally the changes of old age of the parents. And one of the things is to help people get on with those stages rather than being stuck in one, like the children never leaving the home. I'm going to talk a little bit about the kinds of problems that can arise, dysfunction. Hand of the cause, Mr. Robarts told a story at the Minnesota Baha'i Summer School a few years ago about a family that had been forbidden to bring their child to the feast because the child was so disruptive. Somehow, Mr. Robarts managed to make it okay for the parents to bring the child to feast, and no sooner had the child arrived than the child started going bananas and disrupting the whole meeting. Aha, bad child. Or was that the case? Mr. Robarts went on to say that he then asked all the people to calmly reflect in personal prayer. What happened? The child calmly went over and sat on his father's lap. The child had been obligingly fulfilling the community's expectations of him to disrupt the meeting. This expectation can be communicated in many nonverbal ways. The child's behavior was a symptom of the community's expectations. Another form of dysfunction that can occur in religious families is that one's relationship to the laws and the rest of the faith can be dysfunctional. By a too obsessive focus on one law or one principle to the exclusion of others, or by a grandiose sense of one's importance, or by a grandiose sense of inferiority, those things can cause problems. I want to talk some about this phenomena of triangulation, which is related to backbiting, but it's more subtle. And I'll describe it. Just to give a couple of examples first, there's a song by Bob Dylan in which he says that in ceremonies of the horsemen, talking about the chessboard, and the horsemen are the knights, the royalty, even the pawn must hold a grudge. And then there's the observation that the battles between the superpowers in the world are often fought out in third world countries. And the conflicts of parents are often mirrored in their children. The name most associated with triangulation is a family therapist by the name of Murray Bowen. And I don't know anybody to do this except to read it. It's one of the most important things I want to get across, so I'm going to do it. He says a two-person emotional system is unstable in that it forms itself into a three-person system under stress. In the Baha'i world, I hope this is not going to be the case. The following are some of the characteristics of the functioning of a triangle. As tension mounts in a two-person system, it is usual for one to be more uncomfortable than the other, for the uncomfortable one to triangle in a third person by telling the second person the story about the triangle one. So you've got three people involved in what was an emotional situation between two people. That's the basic set. And there are many, many aspects to it. And it can have different aspects. And I recommend reading about it. In periods of very high tension, a system will triangle in more and more outsiders. A common example is a family in great stress that uses the triangle system to involve neighbors, schools, police, clinics, and a whole spectrum of outside people as participants in the family problem. The family thus reduces the tension within its inner family and can actually create a situation in which the family tension is being fought out by outside people. It's just amazing to see different agencies fighting with each other about what should be going on with one particular family. Triangles are created and function in other ways than simply backbiting. Parents can escape the tension in their marriage by over-focusing on a child. Doesn't have anything to do with backbiting, but it's a destructive process. You can escape interpersonal tension by triangling in a part of your body and create a psychosomatic complaint. You can triangulate in the rest of the world, the two of us against the world. There are many triangles. The Oedipal triangle is just one of many. Backbiting, gossip, and triangulation are bad because they are destructive of an invisible betweenness, the relationships between people. An act of backbiting by two people about a third is destructive of three relationships. It may be a paradox that triangulation, which is so positive of strength in the physical world, this is the most strongest structure there is when everything's connected, the tetrahedron's all made out of triangles, is so destructive in the human world. I got so much to say about triangles, but I'm going to have to move on from them. Now I want to talk about therapy a little bit. All healing comes from God. It is prayer, obedience to institutions, and seeking out competent physicians and following their advice that fosters the flow of healing. Therapy is therapy. It is not psychodynamics, counseling, admonitions, social work, sociology, analysis, or education. In the sense that all of these help, they are therapeutic. But what I am calling therapy may make use of these, but is not them. Therapy is creating a situation that allows the person's own growthful forces to function. Aspects of therapy include increasing the patient's awareness of options. I love this example because most people think they live in a three-dimensional universe, or if they want to be sophisticated, they say the fourth dimension is time. Well, the three dimensions are modeled here by the orange struts. The purple rods model a six-dimensional universe, and it's a physical model. You can see it right here. There's nothing imaginary about it. We have many more options than we think we do. It's part of being such a high order of wholeness. Assisting people to do their own thinking rather than having them let their words do their thinking for them. Therapy includes waiting, allowing time for things to change. Helping people to recognize the ways they triangulate and are triangulated. And correcting flat earth concepts of the world and the mind, such as going off the deep end, going out of your mind, starting to really listen to how people use language. Family therapy is like a mixture of homeopathy and surgery. Sometimes we prescribe the symptom. It's like the person who is rocking back in his chair. You push him back a little farther, and he automatically self-corrects, and he'll either sit up straight or stand up. I think that inflation is God's way of prescribing the symptom. Knowing how attached we are to money, He's arranging for us to have more and more of it. This is related to the aspect of therapy where we take things to absurd conclusions so as to deflate them. The amount of money is inflated, but the value of it is deflated. And therapy is like surgery, and then one has to make decisions and be incisive. One has to decide whether to proceed with a family therapy session when they haven't brought in dad, or when they haven't brought in mom, or the most important child at the moment. In therapy, we learn to play with language so as to be freed from getting stuck in the picture it creates. We learn to have fun, and so as to achieve some mastery over verbal communication. I think that Baha'is are going to function in this triangulated world in kind of a reverse Ice 9 way. If you've ever read Cat's Cradle by Kurt Vonnegut, he talks about a special new form of ice. It's a crystal that when it comes in contact with other water, it immediately crystallizes it all, and it doesn't matter what the temperature is. And it gets into the water supply of the world, and the world dies because all the water becomes crystallized. Well, Baha'is are like a reverse Ice 9 in that they're going to detriangulate the world. They're not going to backbite. They're not going to make other people fight I'm not going to make other people fight my spiritual battles. And this is going to decrystallize human relations. It's like taking the arthritis out of frozen joints. Therapy views the unconscious as a wellspring of healing and not a cesspool of feelings. Family therapy is an effort to get Baha'i principles working within the family. Therapy tries to create a sense of the whole through creating family trees, through discovering covertly shared feelings and anxieties, through having the same name and having the same family myth. These are some of the ways of creating a sense of the whole in the family. Therapy makes use of poetry in that it makes use of the same. It makes use of metaphor. Therapist Milton Erickson treated the bedwetter by never talking about his bedwetting or his bladder or his urethra, but by talking about the muscle that surrounds the pupil of the eye controlling its size. He was able to do it in such a way that the patient gained control over another circular muscle, that which controls the outflow from the bladder. Family therapy makes use of poetry, of similarity by prescribing the symptom, as I just described. It is poetic in the attempt to use the patient's way of talking about the world. In dealing with some autistic children, we will attempt to reciprocate behaviors, not to intrude, until eventually there is a reciprocity of initiative in the relationship. This is extraordinary to see. Therapy is a process of language contamination, of contaminating the primary process or the symbolic aspect of our thinking. This is skillfully done by family therapist Carl Whitaker. My image of this is that people very carefully bring their stuckness, their fossilized problems, into him. They carefully separate the sedimentary slates surrounding the fossil and say, this is what's bothering me. Then in a sympathetic, concerned or indifferent or concerned indifferent way, Whitaker will place some foreign object between those sedimentary slates by something he says or does so that the patient can never close those slates tightly together again and keep his fossilized problems intact. That induces a change which leads to a whole chain reaction of changes. Good therapists don't get stuck in one way of working. They don't have just one technique or something that they do, and they're willing to live with their own anxiety. An aspect of therapy is the phenomenon of reframing, which goes along with the Baha'i teaching that there is no evil. Reframing reinterprets the negative behavior as being an act of sacrifice of the individual in defense of the family. The little kid is acting out so that dad won't have to face up to the fact that he's cheating on his income taxes. Therapy attempts to create the environment for another's learning. And finally, from Star of the West, Abdul Baha, being quoted on rigidity. Holding to the letter of the law is many times an indication of a desire for leadership. The alphabet of things is for children, that they may in time use their reasoning powers. When some follow merely the hard and fixed letter of the law, they deprive it of its elastic quality, the spirit, and endeavor to convert it into a hard instrument of inflexible qualities.